I feel like I'm back in school here. We're in the old schoolhouse in Keysville, which is now the village offices, and I noticed when we sat down at this table, inside the door there is a legend that says homemaking. So if we start to talk about a strawberry souffle or something before the day is through, you know we got a little bit off track. We're delighted to be joined today by Gunther Bauer, on my left, your right, and Ron Allen, historian in Peru, right, Ron?
Correct.
And we're going to just talk about old stuff.
Fine.
I'm the only old person in this trio, but we have a right to talk about old stuff, right, Gunther?
Right.
This is, if this room echoes, it's not my fault. I can imagine what it must be like teaching a class here in this building. You said you thought 1936.
I think about 1936. I know Peru's cornerstone reads 1938, and the school here in Keysville, I think, preceded Peru's by about 2 years.
Galvin and I have been in this building a few times. We did a program with the Genealogical Society, which has offices here. I work as a crime victims advocate in the Department of Probation, and I've been here for trials. And the first thing I noticed when we parked the car was a monstrous wood pile out back, because this building is heated with those big logs and has been as far back as I can remember. And that might supplant the tremendous price that people are going to pay for fuel oil this year.
It does a fine job. It keeps the building toasty warm, even on the coldest days in the winter.
It sure is toasty warm most of the time if they don't forget to put wood on. And then it's not necessarily that cold when they have to come in here in the middle of the night to arraign somebody, or, you know. Gunther, let's get a little background information about you. Who is Gunther Bauer? Where did you come from?
Well, I was born in Pennsylvania, Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and my parents went to New York City in 1931. That gives you my age. It's about 1 year old. And I lived on Long Island most of my life.
Did you where?
Well, we kept moving from the city out to the end of Long Island.
That's the way it works. You know?
Yep. I lived in Astoria for a while, Richmond Hill, Cambria Heights. I don't know if any of those names are familiar to you.
Of course they are.
And then we finally, after I got married, I lived in Port Jefferson for about 30 some odd years.
Did you really?
Yeah, and I worked for Grumman Aerospace company. And,
Anybody from Long Island knows about
oh,
Grumman.
yeah. When I worked there, they had, at one time, they had like 32,000 people working.
Think about that, huh? Plattsburgh plus another 10,000.
I worked in the environmental control group on aircraft, as an engineer, on aircraft and various space projects. I was fortunate enough to work on the lunar landing
Wow.
project in the environmental control group. And that was the highlight of my career.
That's a pretty darn good highlight. If you're going to drop a little tidbit of information, that's good. You might as well start with NASA, right? That's great.
I finally retired in 1990.
I was going to say, boy, that's a good one. 1990, so 14 years ago, a little more than that.
Yeah, and at the time we had a vacation home up in the Adirondacks. And we decided to move up here and make it a permanent residence. And in 1991, my wife and I moved up here.
That's a story that you hear so many times. Either they were stationed here on the base and decided to come here, or they had a summer home here and decided to come back. A lot of the residents here are trying to get out of here in the wintertime, and you're trying to come back. It's a very special place. Yeah. And it's got great history, doesn't it?
Yes, it sure does. And actually, I've been interested in history most of my life. I joined the National Stereoscopic Association back in 1975. I was also a member, still am.
I didn't know they had a National Stereoscopic Association.
Here's another new
Are you
member.
really? He got you into it, huh?
He did. He really did.
I also
That's
belong to the American Photographic Historical Society, based in New York City. Let's see, I've been with both of those associations, well, like 20 years. 25 years. And when I moved up here, I was already collecting stereo views and other photographs, historical type photographs. So and then I found out Sable Forks didn't really have a historical society, and that's near where our home is. So I investigated and found out there was a historical society in Keysville, and I joined. And now I'm a member of the Anderson Falls Heritage Society, currently the president, and Ron is the vice president.
This, you know, this is going to be another whole program sometime. If we're all strong enough and, you know, maybe in the new year, when the weather gets a little warmer in the spring, we'll get together and do the whole thing on the history of Anderson Falls, because I'm sure there are viewers watching this program right now. They're saying, Anderson Falls,
Yep.
Why does that sound familiar? Well, it's where it all started here, isn't it, huh?
Yes.
So we're going to do that sometime. Of course, I was brought up with this device you have over here to your left. Everybody's grandmother, or if you're as old as we are, their parents had one of these in their homes, and it's called
Well, this is called a stereo viewer, and this is a stereo card.
Let me just show our viewers what we're talking about. This device was invented.
Well, the concept behind stereo viewing actually goes back to 1830, and that was before there was photography. But there were people that were able to make two drawings side by side, and when you looked at them through a viewer like this, you could see them in depth. So the concept was already there when photography came around in 1840, 1840, and some of the first photographs ever taken were stereo views.
And some young people would like to think it's a relatively modern invention, because I can remember the first 3D movies, as you can, right?
Sure.
But I can also remember a little device as a small child that was called a Viewmaster,
Oh, yeah.
that involved a disc with duplicate photographs, and they were in color. And in my case, since my father was a minister, they were all religious themes, but they were real, really, really neat. So this device was wonderful. You can adjust it
Just right.
for your eyes.
And the views look alike, you can't really tell the difference.
No.
But there is a distinct difference. And I guess the best way to explain that is, if you look at your finger with one eye and then look at it with the other eye, there is a difference, the way you see it. You see more of this side, one eye, and more of that with others. As you move
I'm
it away.
sure we've done that as kids. They taught us, put your finger together and just look at the middle, and you'll see a little hot dog finger with two fingernails in between. And right now, because people love to do what I tell them to, you got 40,000 people out there saying, I don't know what he's talking about.
Right.
Anyway, you're right.
And even though you can't tell the difference between these two views, there is a difference. And the only way you can't see the depth by just looking at it like that. Some people can, actually. They have this
Not me.
ability to do it, but I haven't.
I can't ever find the 7 things that are wrong in the children's newspaper every Sunday morning either.
The way to see this now is to put it in a viewer, and the viewer has a divider here, so that this eye only sees this side, and this eye only sees that side.
And the brain...
And the brain sorts it out and gives you the
together
depth.
and gives you the depth,
right.
and that's kind of neat. How, we are so fortunate, I should point out, you talk about the early days of photography. We're so lucky here in the North Country to have literally thousands and tens of thousands of photographs from the early history of photography from this area. There are the Stoddard photographs of the Adirondack region are legendary. Many of those are still in boxes. The late Maitland DeZormo, who was one of the great authors of the North Country, happened to be a dear friend of mine, and he had a lot of those. I don't know whatever
I
happened.
met with him back in '92,
Did you really?
shortly before he died, that winter, I believe. And I had done an article on Seneca Ray Stoddard, and he became aware of it and asked me to come over and talk to him. So,
And boy, You know, I thought I could, very good at lip flapping, but he could match me any day. He was an old football coach and a really crusty old guy and just
He
so
was
much.
Quite an individual, I
He
liked
was
him.
great. Every time he'd put a book together, he'd come down and I'd interview him on the radio and get an autographed copy of the book, and it's a nice collection that I have now. So, anyway, photographs, there are lots around.
Yes.
And some of them are still hidden in people's attics and
Unfortunately,
boxes down
that's true,
cellar.
yeah.
And
But they're getting harder and harder to find as time goes by, unless you go to eBay or some of the photographic shows. And there you can, find them, but they can cost you quite a bit of money, too.
so how did you get involved with the photographs themselves?
Well, that's sort of an interesting story because back in the 70s when the work I was involved in Grumman was sort of declining, I was looking for a good hobby. One time we went to a antique show on Long Island, and my wife noticed a viewer on the table. And she said, "Oh, look at that." So I didn't even know what it was at that time, believe it or not.
No kidding, you hadn't been exposed to it?
No, I guess it's because,
Sheltered life.
well, no, my family was, I'm first generation here. So my mother and father came over in the 1920s, and, they just bought the clothing off the,
That's what they did.
they came with the clothing on their
Sure.
back, so to speak. So we didn't have a lot of old things in the house, and I probably had seen it before, but maybe I never paid attention to it. Anyhow, she had just gotten, my wife, she had just gotten $25 from her mother to spend any way she wanted to. And it just happened it was $25 at that time. Now they run about $100.
Yeah.
And so she bought it and bought a small group of views with it. And I got interested, and within a short time, I was pretty involved.
And you were collecting.
I started collecting, yes.
And you have how many?
Well, I had thousands at one time, but
You had thousands?
thousands.
Oh, goodness.
But I have, over the past 5 or 6 years, sold a lot of them and given some away and so forth.
So you have quite a few left.
I have, mainly what I have left is all Adirondack,
So you're focused.
mainly northern New York. I do have a presidential collection, presidents from Lincoln up to Eisenhower.
Well, that's kind of neat.
I also have a collection of Teddy Roosevelt stereo views and Ulysses Grant stereo views. Those I intend to keep.
Wow. He impressed me when he sat down here, but he's blowing me right out of the tub now. Because
Anyhow,
that,
it's been a great hobby for me. It's kept me busy, and I've met a lot of nice people. And my wife and I go to, even this day, we go to a stereo view in Boston, stereo view show in Boston. Ron has gone to that also.
really?
And you can pick up stereo views there, trade cards, get together with old friends.
It
and-
starts with baseball cards and works its way up. Have you got a lot of them too, Ron?
Not nearly as many as Gunther. He's way ahead of me, and I
My
probably,
name?
I never will approach the numbers that he had. I tend to collect mainly local stereo views, Keysville, Ausable Chasm, Birmingham Falls, as it was known before it became Ausable Chasm. So I tend to concentrate on the local ones. Never will approach Gunther's numbers.
Well, when I started, they were affordable. They're not.
That's the
They're not
problem
really
with all of
affordable
these
anymore.
old things. Somebody finds out that they're collects what the word collectible means, and as soon as they know they're collectible, you can buy it on eBay. I have to tell a quick story, and then we're going to move on. When I was a kid, I had a toy called a hootenanny, which neither one of you guys have ever heard of. The modern descendant of that is called a spirograph. But in those days, it was a small green object about this wide with a circle on it and teeth around the edge. And it had a V-shaped object that could be opened and closed because it was on a fulcrum on a hinge, and it had holes in it. And you had a little crank on the side, and you'd put this object here, hook it up at the different holes, put a pencil in the end, and turn the crank. And it would draw regular designs on the paper, and it was called a hootenanny, and they were around for a few years during the war years, and then materials got scarce, or somebody decided they could make them a lot cheaper out of plastic, and so they're not around anymore. And I wrote a column about it, and it generated hundreds of comments from around the world, believe it or not, and some wonderful lady whose husband is a retired engineer wrote me from out west and said, we have to have one for our granddaughter or great-granddaughter. What do we do? I said, go on eBay. I've never opened eBay yet without seeing one or two hootenannies. They had never bid on anything on eBay before. That's an experience the first time. Calvin's done it often. They bid on the first one and lost it and got the second one, and they were so thrilled you'd think I'd have given them $1 million. Where did you buy your, now
this particular viewer is custom made.
oh yeah, I should have known that somebody as classy as you would have a custom-made
No,
viewer.
the reason I bought this viewer is because the old viewers, the hood is very narrow,
Yes.
and people with glasses can't get in there to really see it very well. They have to keep adjusting. Whereas if you wear glasses and you just get the adjustment one time, then it's good for all
So
pictures.
you had this made for you?
No, there was a fellow that started to make these in 1990, and that's about when I picked this up.
Do you have some old ones too, though?
I had a bunch of old ones, and at one time my wife and I did a stereo view station type thing in the Kent the Lord student days. I don't know if you're familiar with that. I don't think they do that anymore, but
Well, a lot of kids go in
Yeah.
and out, though.
and they go to old classrooms and to a place where goats were, with the blacksmith shop, and ours was the stereo view shop. And there I would give a small introduction as to what stereo views were. And then we had about 10 or 12 stereo viewers laid out with pictures. And the children would come by and look at them. And we'd get remarks like, stupendous, wow, cool.
Well, don't you find it amazing, Gunther, and you too, Ron, that in this day and age, with all the modern, amazing computer games and things that kids have access to, that they would be blown away by these ancient views? Isn't it cool?
Very true. My grandparents had a stereo viewer, and just a few stereo views, but I can distinctly recall as a small child, probably 6 or 7 or 8 years old, occasionally I dig that out, and as you say, that third dimension concept was just mind-blowing. I enjoyed those very, very much.
Do you have cards that he doesn't have?
Oh, sure.
Really?
Well, you have sent me some copies of what you had.
Very few. Gunther has a very extensive collection, and I'm a beginner compared to him. I really didn't become interested in stereo views. I was taking a course at Clinton Community College in photography, and this was about 92, 93, and became interested in Seneca Ray Stoddard. And Gunther had just, he mentioned an article that he wrote, or an article about him that was in the local paper, Plattsburgh Press Republican. And I remembered that article, found it, and gave Gunther a call, because I was doing a presentation on the area pioneer photographers. And I'd never met Gunther, but I just called him out of the blue, and he was very congenial on the phone, and invited me over to his house, and even let me borrow some pictures, some stereo views to use in my presentation at Clinton Community. And it just kind of snowballed from there. I've always been interested in history, and it just went from there. I've become very interested in stereo views, particularly of the local area.
If you had to guess, how many stereo views do you think were taken of this Adirondack region? Or would you know that?
I can tell you roughly how many Seneca Ray Stoddard took. 2,500 stereo views. That doesn't include his other larger format.
Thousands and thousands of others in the larger
Some,
format.
I heard something like 6,000 by him.
Isn't that cool? I mean, we're so lucky to have that legacy that he left us, aren't we?
He was a fine photographer and was prolific also. He went all over. And
Well, that's what they did. It was a relatively new form for him, as it was for Brady during the Civil War. Where would we have been in our knowledge of the Civil War if it weren't for those Massey Brady photographs?
I think a lot of people don't realize that the photographs they're looking at sometimes are stereo views, because they only show the one half.
Sure.
In fact, I can really say the earliest outdoor photographs are basically stereo views. Stereo views predate the postcard by 30 to 50 years, depending on what area you're in. So,
That's wonderful. So you took these and you put them in, first of all, you've made copies and you got them in book form over here on the other table so that people can flip the pages. Our viewers to this program are used to seeing pictures in books like that because the late Ron Venn was a master at what we call the before and after photograph. This young man would find an old photograph, such as you have, and he would go and stand on that bluff, try to find the exact perspective, and snap today's photograph, and it may be a school was where a tree was, or whatever, and he would do the little history thing, and then he'd do the next page, and he did, how many, Calvin? Over 1,000 that we're aware of, and that he had the bad sense to die young after we had done over, a dozen or 13 of these documentary programs with him. So, yes, our audience is familiar with the old photographs, and they love it. Because somebody will look at these scenes and they'll say, I've been there. That mountain looks just the same today as it did back then.
at one time, I thought about doing that myself. I do have a stereo view camera.
Do you
And
really?
occasionally I use it, yeah.
You know, I haven't seen any modern stereo view photographs, but I know they exist.
Well, when we had the ice storm, I took quite a group.
Did you really?
Took a group of views.
Got enough to do a whole show, Gunther?
No, just a couple around the property showing all the trees that are there.
We got some mileage out of that ice storm. Not that we're looking forward to another spectacle like that, but Calvin's got about 100 million miles of tape. I don't think most of it hasn't even been aired yet, has it? It's just in the can. Not yet. Here we are, 6 years later, right? So anyway, how many of these have you committed to your slideshows?
Well, this past 2 years, I guess, right around now. I did three slideshows here. One was on Started, one was on Baldwin, which we're going to see tonight. The other was on general photographers who photographed Au Sable Chasm. And then prior to that, I did an actual 3D show in Lake Placid at the station there, at the railroad station. And that I had some help because I don't have a 3D projector. So there were my views and they were this other gentleman's projectors. And we showed a show on Started that evening.
How did you coordinate that?
Well, this fellow, Stiles is his name, Stuart Stiles. He's a preacher down in Middletown, New York, I believe. We both belong to the National Stereoscopy Association. So he called me, and eventually we got together, and I sent him my views, and he processed them and made slides out of them. The slides will look just like this, only they're little 35 millimeter slides. And then we made arrangements to have the show done in Lake Placid, and we had about 50 people there. And it went off very well. Of course, you have to wear glasses.
Of course you got to wear the glasses. I still got a few pairs somewhere.
And we did have some problems along the way with focusing, but that's usually the case with 3D shows. They're limited as to how good they are because you have to sit in the middle of the room to get the best view. If you're off to the side, sometimes it's not so.
You've seen, I'm sure, some of the spectacular 3D movie presentations. I remember when Disney World first opened down in Orlando, Florida, taking our grandchildren down there when Michael Jackson, when it was in his heyday, and they had a film with Michael Jackson. And sitting, I was just as enthusiastic as the kids were because objects came out of the screen and you thought you were going to be punched right in the mouth or kicked in the head or whatever it happened to be. So, yeah, it's an amazing sensation.
You can get that with stereo views too. There's a special way to take those pictures, and you'll look at it. Let's say someone's pointing a rifle at you, and it looks like that rifle is out of the picture, right in front of your nose.
It's wonderful.
Those effects are dramatic.
So how many are we going to get to look at today?
Today we have about 70 some odd views by Baldwin, and there's a couple in there by Stoddard.
Let's talk about the Baldwin Studios now. Where was that centered? Right here?
Well, the pictures we're going to see tonight were done from a period from 1873 to about 1878. And that was while he had a studio here on Keysville and Front Street. Later on, in 1882, he moved to Plattsburgh for 10 years. Had a studio there. Then he moved to Saranac Lake, had another studio there for 10 years.
I had forgotten that. I'm glad you mentioned that. I'd forgotten that completely.
Yeah. And then I guess it was 1993, his wife got very sick, and they moved to Rutland, Vermont, where his wife had several sisters living there.
In 1893, right?
93.
Yeah.
And his wife died shortly thereafter. But he had a studio over there, and he would have it there for another 25 years. So he was in the photographic business for over 50 years, 30 years of which were in the Adirondack area.
And just by way of a little background, and I want to get to the slides, and I'm sure our viewers are anxious to see them, but the average citizen did not have a camera in 1880.
That's right.
And until the little Kodak Brownie came along after the turn of the century, a lot of people didn't have their own cameras, and so they relied on photography studios. And before that, you had to get somebody's portrait painted, didn't you?
Well, it wasn't until Eastman Kodak developed his camera and film processing that the camera was available to the average
For the
person.
masses, yeah. And so people eventually came around to taking all the pictures we take today, and now we're in the digital age, and it adds a whole other dimension, right, Ron?
Right. And just an aside, Gordy, you mentioned Matthew Brady a moment ago, and of course he became famous taking pictures of the Civil War. And we know about Seneca Ray Stoddard, another great pioneer photographer. But there was a third one also from this area, William Henry Jackson.
Oh, of course.
Who was born right here in Keysville and then moved to Peru when he was about 5 years old. But those three pioneer photographers really paved the way. And this area right here in Keysville was really a focal point for pioneer photography.
Isn't that interesting? And then there are so many other good photographers that succeeded those folks in this Adirondack region, from Lake Placid all the way down to Plattsburgh, and we see their pictures, we see their stamps on old photographs, and there are boxes and boxes of wonderful glass plates taken of Plattsburgh back from the 1920s on, and they still all haven't been developed. Have you seen some of those?
Oh yeah, I have several of
I should have known.
Plattsburgh that I picked up.
Right, Ron?
They're not
Yeah, I got
stereo
a few of
views.
those. No, they're not
They're
stereo views.
5x8s, and I
But
think
that doesn't mean they're inferior because they're not stereo views, because there was some wonderful photography.
yeah, the ones I have by a photographer named Bigelow, who was pretty well known in Plattsburgh.
It's neat.
But what we're going to see tonight will be just a slice of history, between 1873 and 1878. But this was an important time because at this point in time in our area, the industry started to decline a little bit, and tourism was coming into the area. So we'll see some of that tonight.
I love it. Reminding you that in spite of the fact that A lot of people from Long Island didn't really know too much about Keysville before they got here. Osable Chasm was very well known around the world back in those days.
It sure was. And the show we got set up for tonight is sort of approached the way a tourist would approach it. We show you Port Kent, where the tourists came into this area. It was a gateway to the Adirondacks. Then we'll take a look at Osable Chasm. And then from Osable Chasm, we'll travel to Keysville, look at that town. And then from Keysville, we'll go to Osable Forks. And then from Osable Forks, we'll go into interior of the Adirondacks. And that's the way the tourists traveled. So we're going to look at that.
That's going to be so much fun. Everybody likes to look at old pictures. And we're going to do that, and we hope you all enjoy it. So please stay with us with Gunther Bauer and Ron Allen. Well, we got our popcorn, and we got our juju beans, and we're set to go. Gunther, here we go. You tell us what's going on. Is that him? Is that George?
Well, that's a good question. I think it is, but I'm not 100% sure. This view was taken on the backside of Whiteface Mountain, and it's taken from near a hotel that was called French's Hotel. And I believe it's probably George W. Baldwin, but I haven't been able to prove it. Lots of times photographers took their own pictures, and they'd have a wire going to their hand. You notice the hand is sort of hidden here, and they'd take their own picture. This is our first view, and all the photographs you're about to see, except for two, I believe, are by George W. Baldwin. During the time he was at his Keysville studio. Here we have the Mull Block building. And you can see where a sign is on the end here. That's about a 5x4 sign. And Baldwin's studio was located in this white light area portion. He was upstairs, had a studio upstairs. Not too much is known about George Baldwin's early life. He was born in Osable Forks area, in Jay actually, on Green Street in 1849. His parents then moved, in the 1850s, they moved to an area right outside Osable Forks, about a mile along a road that is now known as 9N. And that's where they operated a farm. And we know this from census that were taken during the 1850s, 60s, 70s, and the 80s. An 1870 census shows us that Baldwin's occupation at that time was an artist. And he was still living with his parents at the Blackbrook farm location on 9N. He was one of 10 children. I believe he was the second youngest child in that family. The next thing we know is that in 1872, there was a marriage announcement in the Plattsburgh Sentinel paid newspaper.
In 1872, yeah.
Yeah, is that what I said?
No, say 19, but...
1872, I'm sorry.
We know what they
I jump in and out all the time. He was married in Osable Forks in the American House, and he married Margaret Hargraves, who was the daughter of John Hargraves, who was the proprietor of the American House at that time. Margaret Hargraves was the granddaughter of Matthew Adgate, who was the first settler in the Osable Chasm region. John Hargraves, George's father-in-law, bought the American House from the J.J. and Rogers Company in Osable Forks. Prior to that, he lived in Keysville, and he was very well known in both towns. And then from there, we Also, at the time that he was married, we know that George Baldwin was now living in Port Henry. And I believe during that period, he was probably serving an apprenticeship with another photographer in Port Henry. The next thing we know is in 1873, excuse me, he and his wife moved to Keysville, and he opened his studio, shown here. This is the Mould Block building, owned by Mould and Son. This portion of the building here was destroyed by a fire, but this portion right here is still standing today. Here we have a great picture of Port Kent back in about 1875. Up until 1870, Port Kent was strictly an industrial port, servicing the logging industry and the iron industry. Iron would be brought down to here by stagecoach, same with lumber, and then it would be shipped out on barges. But starting in 1870, several things happened. Well, Sable Chasm was first opened to the public in 1870. Also, this was a post-Civil War period. It was an optimistic period when people were looking to get back to nature. William Murray, a preacher, had written a book in 1869 romanticizing the Adirondacks as the last great frontier in the East. Also, another factor was that now railroads came to the fringes of the Adirondacks, and you could get into the Adirondacks and Osable Chasm by railroad, starting in 1875, that would be. Next. Here's a view
Oh
that...
boy, what a shot. I love it.
Here's a view that George Baldwin took, and it's a view of the Champlain, which ran aground near north of Westport, in between Port Kent and Westport. And no one was hurt. But as you can see, the hull is pretty well demolished. And Champlain was originally called the Oak Ames. And before it was refurbished, it used to run trains across Champlain Lake. And then in 1873, it was refurbished and by the Champlain Transportation Company, and was used as a backup steamship to the Vermont II, which was one, and the Adirondack. Now, those two steamers continuously ran north-south along Lake Champlain. When one was going north, the other one was going south. In fact, it was the Adirondack steamer that picked up the stranded passengers of this wreck. Here's another view of the same wreck from a different vantage point. As I said, the hull was pretty much destroyed, but the Champlain Transportation Company salvaged the engines and many other parts of the ship. Eventually, the hull just disappeared. The ship was about 250 feet long. It had 40 some odd staterooms, and it could hold about 100 people in its dining room. And it was nearly as big as the Vermont and the Adirondack, but not quite. And they were similar in nature, in size. Next, please. Now here's a view of the railroad line. Before 1875, the railroad only went as far as Whitehall, and then you had to take a steamship to get up to Port Kent. But in 1875, the line was extended from Whitehall to Plattsburgh, and of course Port Kent would be one of its stops. Also now it's possible to get to Port Kent in the off months, whereas before, the steam ships could only run during the summer months. In the winter, they would be laid up in Shelburne, Vermont. Here's a neat view of 4 stagecoaches leaving Port Kent. And this picture is taken from one of the dock buildings. And they're all headed, as you can see, for the chasm and the Adirondacks. They would make a left turn down the end here and then go up a plank road, which is about 3 miles long, to get to our Sable Chasm. And some would continue on to Keysville.
What a great shot, isn't it?
It sure is.
So much character in that. And there it is.
Now this was probably the first real inn at a Sable Chasm. It couldn't accommodate many people. I believe it was 25 people. But it had a dining room which could accommodate 2 or 3 times that number. And before 1875, this was the place to go. It was originally a residence, and in 1869 it was converted into the inn that you see here. H. Brownlee was the proprietor, and at that time he arranged tours for a Sable Chasm. In fact, he was the tour guide, and it said that many of the geological formations were named by him.
Ah.
Now here we have a view, excuse me, about a year later, and this is that house on top is the Lakeview House, which was built in, they started building in 1874 and I believe was completed in 1875. This is the town area called Birmingham at that time. And you can see some of the old mill buildings here. And this was Applegate's store here, which in 1877 became, also included a post office. And it was in 1877 that the area name changed from Birmingham to our Sable Chasm. This was a newly built bridge about the same time that the Lakeview House was built. Prior to that, we had the old wooden type rustic bridges there. Here's a winter scene of the same area. As far as I know, Baldwin was the only one to take any winter scenes in our Sable Chasm. And this is one of them. And again, this is one of his earliest views. In fact, the number of this view is view number 1.
Come on. Isn't that neat?
It looks like he took winter scenes before he took any summer scenes. So we believe that's in late 74 that this was taken. And again, here's the store. Now here's the backside of the Lakeview House, which overlooks the lake, hence Lakeview House. Actually, the lake was quite a bit away. It was about 1.5 miles to 2 miles down a gentle slope that went to the shores of the lake. On the other side, of course, was the view you got there was Birmingham Falls, now known as Rainbow Falls, and Horseshoe Falls, which was really the grand entrance to our Sable Chasm.
There are people sitting on the porch roofs. The windows are open and there's a guy out there just enjoying himself. I bet you see new details every time you look at it.
Yeah, it's true, you really do. We were looking at these views earlier yesterday, and my wife noticed one view had a bunch of horses in it. I had never noticed it
Never
before.
seen the horses before.
This building at the end here was there originally, and it belonged to one of the Adgate grandchildren. And the part of the building that was built in 1875 is from here on down, plus the porch.
Very tall Abraham Lincoln stovepipe hat, and the gentleman right about in the middle of the picture is that. Look how tall that one is.
Yep.
Great stuff.
Of course, you can see the stagecoach here.
Oh, sure.
It stopped on that side because that's where the road went. Now here's a view. It's not too sharp in contrast. A lot of these views, with time, they have faded if they weren't kept out of the sun. I believe that's what happened here. But this is taken from the bandstand that was right next to the Lakeview House. And you're looking at the stairway that goes down to the lower level here. And then the bridge that I showed before is right here. And then this is the Birmingham hamlet here. And Matthew Atgate's first cabin was back in this area here. And he was probably the first settler to settle that entire region between Keysville and Osable Chasm. Now here's a nicely composed view of Birmingham Falls. Birmingham Falls previously was known as Atgate Falls, and then it was called High Falls, and then it became Birmingham Falls, and now we know it as Rainbow Falls. And this is Horseshoe Falls here. And this picture was probably taken from a point near the entrance lodge building where everyone passed through to get into the chasm. And that would let you down at the shore level over by Horseshoe Falls. Next. Oops. Here we have a picture of the entrance lodge.
Isn't that amazing? I've never seen it before. I love it.
And this was taken probably in 1874. Building was finished then, although it wasn't officially open until 1875. As you can see, it's a pagoda-type place with 8 sides to it, and each side had an amber and blue window in it. It had restrooms inside and other conveniences. And also it was a place from where photographs were sold, stereo views and regular photographs. And George W. Baldwin in 1874 became the sales agent for the photographs that were sold from that point.
Makes perfect sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, because he had a studio in town, so he made arrangements for people's views to be sold at this lodge and also from his studio. Now I should point out the first year that Baldwin had his studio in Keysville, he was strictly a portrait photographer. And that would really be his bread and butter for his entire life. But at the same time, he kept taking stereo views and other pictures of the Adirondack area.
Thank goodness for that.
And here's a neat picture that was taken on July 4th, 1875. It was a July 4th celebration, but it was probably also a celebration for the opening of Osable Chasm. During the July 4th celebration, the Lakeview House was open to the public. They served lemonade and food up there. The bandstand had music and dancing, and people were allowed to play croquet on the lawns. And one of the features of that day was Professor Home, as he traveled across this tightrope near Pulpit Rock, not too far from where the lodge was. As he went back and forth, sometimes he would lay down, take it easy, and then get up and move on. And this was about 80 feet up in the air.
No nets, folks.
No nets, right. And so that was the, also that evening, in conclusion, they had fireworks at the falls. So that was more or less the grand opening of
Sounds like fun. Let's do it.
We go a little further on from where that tightrope walk was. We come to Devil's Oven. You can see in the back here. It was about 30 feet long, about 20 feet wide. Here we see some visitors at this particular site. And at Devil's Oven, there was a stairway over to the right here that you could get down to Devil's Oven. So that was an area that was always accessible. Here's another view, looking out of the cave now, down along the rocks. And if we look, we can see Baldwin's dark tent here and some photographic equipment laying here. This was probably just maybe one of his helpers. And taking pictures out in the field at this time was no easy task. A photographer had to bring his dark tent changing boxes, his glass plates, the chemicals required, and he had to have access to water. He would remove the plates from the boxes and prepare them for the exposure. And then he would take them to the camera and expose them to an already focused camera. He would do that ahead of time. And then he quickly had to go back to the dark tent to develop the picture, fix the picture, wash it off and dry it, and then repack it. And that was done until the 1880s, and it was called wet plate photography. In the 1880s, they came up with a dry process where you didn't require to do all this. The pictures would be taken back to the studio and printed on paper and then mounted. Now here we see a walkway upstream of Devil's Oven. In 1873, a group from Philadelphia had the Lakeview House built. And not only did they build the Lakeview House, but they went ahead and put in stairways, walkways, and bridges along the entire length of the chasm up to Table Rock. And now for the first time, visitors could travel along the entire area instead of going to specific spots. as Devil's Oven was accessible before 1873, so was Table Rock and the basin at the very end of the chasm. Here's what they call the long gallery, a long walkway. And you had to be careful where you built stairways like this.
I would guess that would be true, yeah.
And as you can see, it's sort of precariously attached to the ledge there. It was not uncommon for walkways, bridges, and stairways to be swept away during spring floods.
As we well know, even from recent years, don't we? Huh?
Yeah, it's said that the water can rise as high as 30 feet during these floods.
Yeah, we've seen the results of several of those massive floods starting in the 40s right up to the last few years, 1996.
Here's a view of a bridge going over to Bromley's Island. And you can see this bridge is in a precarious spot.
Wow.
Probably didn't last very long. There were several islands along here, and then I guess you can see the other one back. It's a little bridge there. And look at these stairways. Yeah. Now we're at Table Rock. And as I said before, Table Rock was accessible by stairways, which you really can't see, but they're in this area, and you can maybe see the bottom portion of it right there. Table Rock was the starting point of the boat ride back in 1874 and 75, and still is to this day. Except they don't use these type of boats anymore. They use rubber rafts. Here we see the boat ride going through the flume, which is the first area entered from Table Rock. And eventually it moves out of the flume and goes by the pool, and then runs several rapids before it enters the basin, where there were carriages waiting for the tourists to take them back to their respective hotels. Now we're going to take a look at Keysville. Keysville is only about a mile away from West Sable Chasm. And back in those days, the through street through Keysville was called Sable Street. I believe that's still the name today. And Sable Street came out right here. If you were coming from West Sable Chasm, you would be traveling that way. In back of the Presbyterian Church. This church was built in 1851. This is the Keysville National Bank, which was built in the early 1870s. And of course, we have the well-known Stone Arch Bridge, which was built, I believe, in 1843. Also, on this side of the street, we have the Osable Horse Nail Company headquarters. And way in the back here was a hotel called the Osable House. You can see the stacks. And this is Main Street. This is as we go up the hill on Main Street, away from the bridge, heading east, we get to the Osable House. The Osable House was probably built about 1839, 1840. It was known that in 1840, Van Buren visited here. The town had a celebration for him that year when he was on election campaign for his second term, which he lost, by the way. Next, please. This view was taken from, the Osable House would be on your right here. So this view is taken down the hill toward the Arch Bridge, and we can see some of the same buildings that we just looked at. Presbyterian Church, Sable Street would come out right here. And down here we have the Osable Nail Company headquarters. And then here was was a doctor. Over here was some shops, including a butcher shop. Now as we continue up that street, we get into the residential area. And here again is the Osable House, only we're back quite a bit further. Now this was an important corner. The moving powers of Keysville all lived in this particular area. Edmund Kingsland lived on this corner. This is the corner of Pleasant and Main. Kingsland lived on one corner. His brother lived across the way. That was Nelson Kingsland. And also over on the other side of the street here, we had Silas Arnold's home, one of the earlier homes in the area. Keyes' house was back roughly where this carriage is. And up the street a little further was a resident of Willis Mould, who owned the Mould block where Baldwin had a studio. This building would have been right next to Willis Mould's building, and it was the Presbyterian parsonage for the church that we pointed out earlier. There were 3 houses similar looking right in this area, and they're right next to the Civic Center right here. Now if we go up a little further to to the spot where we are at now, this was the school that was at this location. This was a private school, and it had a very good reputation, and students came from all over, including from Spoon Lake, Mariah, Elizabethtown. Local people went here too, of course. People with last names like Kingsland and moved.
Go high up in the tree, these kids are. Those branches look a little fragile up there, don't they, huh?
This was actually the second school in the area. The first school being in approximately the same spot. And this was built in the 1840s, I believe, and was there till 1913, a long time. Here's one of the fine residences found on Liberty Street, which is right off Pleasant Street. And this was owned by a granddaughter of Kingsland. And she was married to Dr. J. Willard. And this had, I believe, 5 fireplaces in it, spiral staircases, and had many fine features. Notice the old-time carriage here. Now this is, if we go back to Main Street and go down toward the Arch Bridge, this is right next to the Arch Bridge on the Clinton County side. And here we have a picture of the Horse Nail Headquarters Company. And these two gentlemen here have been identified as Daniel Dodge, inventor of the horse nail machine, and Edmund Kingsland, entrepreneur from Keysville. Daniel Dodge perfected his horse nail machine in 1862, and that was, of course, a boon for Keysville. It led to many industries in the area, mainly horse nail manufacturing.
I'm sure some of our viewers, if you don't mind me interrupting for a moment, have no idea what a horse nail is, and the fact that they had to be made by hand before this.
Yes. Yeah, that's true. His machinery were able to mass produce horse nails, and of course it became very important, not only during the Civil War, but afterwards.
And they looked a lot different from the modern round flat-headed nail. I
Yep.
call them square nail. I like that eagle too, huh? Don't you wish
Yeah.
it existed somewhere today?
Yep. Although this was known as the Horse Nail, or Sable Horse Nail Company at this time, back in 1863, it was called the Eagle Nail Company.
Oh.
And that's why the eagle is up there. The eagle has since disappeared. This building is still there, though.
That sure is.
Here's a closer
There's a
view.
better view of it. Ah.
We're not sure what happened to the eagle, but I believe it was sold to somebody quite a number of years ago. That's the story, right? Now we have moved across the Arch Bridge, and we're in Essex County, the township of Chesterfield. We look back, we can see some of the areas we were at before. This is the residential area way back here, and the school was up in this area. Here's the Osava House, and this is the Grange Building, and this is the headquarters for the nail company, Presbyterian Church. And then we have the bank, and in here we have a hardware company. He was also a tinsmith, so it's a pretty substantial building. And then a lot of the buildings along here were really boarding houses. Again, now we've gone to the end of Main Street, where it intersects with Vine Street. And now we can see some additional buildings we didn't see before. This was the Association Hall here, where theater was conducted, They had concerts there, exhibitions, and so forth. It was a very popular place. And then down here is another building. And this is a bank insurance building. And of course, in the background, we see some of the places we saw before. And I said this side of, in here were quite a few boarding houses and small establishments. Next. Now we've gone back down to the corner of Front and Main. And this building here is the bank insurance building. I don't know the official name of the bank. The insurance building was called out on this sign here, Andy's Insurance, and $1 million it says. I'm not sure what that $1 million means, whether they had coverage up to $1 million or they were worth $1 million. Down the street here we see the Adirondack Hotel. And that's the first Adirondack Hotel. There was another one built later on. Next, please. And down here we're in front of the Mould building where Baldwin Studio is. And we're looking back at Main Street, which ran through here. And we can see one of the small boarding houses here. And this is the hardware tinsmith store. And another view of the insurance bank building. Here we have a view of the Adirondack Hotel, which I believe was taken from Baldwin's second floor story window above this canopy here. Now the Adirondack Hotel was built in about 1850, 1851. In its early days, it was strictly a business type, catering to businesses, but as time went on, it started to cater to tourists also. Within this hotel was also a photo gallery run by a gentleman named Horace Tousley, who also was strictly a portrait photographer, but he also took some views of Keysville and Osable Chasm. And in town, he was Baldwin's only competition.
Linda, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
You see these people standing still, and we think of old photography where if you moved, you'd be a blur. Are these people posing, or were they taking fast enough photo that they could take people moving?
At this point in time, they're probably standing still.
They were posing?
Yeah. I don't know if you noticed on that one picture of the carriages moving out of the dock area. You know, even though those carriages were moving, you notice no movement. But there's a dog running near the wheels of one of those carriages, and you can see his ghost in a couple of different places. Because he was moving across the camera rather than away from it. Away from it, it's hard to detect the emotion.
What would the exposure time be? Any idea? Second, 2 seconds?
I really don't know, to be honest with you.
Interesting. See the sleigh there.
Yes, this is a winter scene, and back in this area was a Baptist church, which you can barely make out. Now here's a great picture under that canopy that we just saw. Baldwin Studio would have been up on the second floor. But here we have a clothing shop. You can see we have a barber shop and a jewelry shop in here. And Mould & Son also in this building had their own drugstore, and they also had their own book and stationery store. The drugstore was run by Mould's son Henry, who was a druggist. And so it was a busy place. And this was really the heart of the business district, and Keysville was along Front Street.
Looks like a stone sidewalk. Huh?
Yeah. There was a lot of stone around. When you look at Keysville, you know, It came into being because of several factors: water power, stone, lumber, and iron ore. Now here we see the results of a fire that swept through Front Street in 1876. Way down at the end here would be the mold block building, which wasn't touched by the fire. But on the this very end, all the way up to this building, that was all wiped out. A lot of that was owned by Edmund Kingsland, where he had various stores next to each other. He was the owner, you know, and then he would have other people that run the businesses. Here's a view looking from in front of the Adirondack Hotel, which I know by this sidewalk here. And you can see the Methodist Church on the very end of the street. The fire stopped short of that by one building, I believe. And again, you could see the devastation on this side of the street. The other side of the street wasn't touched. Here's a close-up of the same picture. And this must have been a Sunday because everybody's dressed up. And Sunday was the only day that nothing went on in Keysville. Next. Now this whole Kingsland block that burned down was replaced with other buildings, and they still stand today. This was the Boynton dry goods store, which probably was built in shortly after 1876. Boynton himself was well known in the area. Before he opened this business, he was the editor for the Essex Republican Press, I think it was called, for about 5-6 years. And then from 1869 to about 74, he rented and managed the Adirondack Hotel. Now here we have a rare interior view of another store. On the back of the view, it said Atwood Store, Front Street. Pretty sure it's one of the Kingsland stores, but I don't know which one. But it was the Atwood Store. And here the young lady's looking at the notion section.
Gas lights.
Gas lights, here's an umbrella.
It's really neat, isn't it? What a great shot.
Next, please. Sorry. Now we're going to look at 3 or 4 views along the river, which will show the various bridges that were located in Keysville, and also which will show some of the industry established along the river. Here we're looking at the Arch Bridge again. And this is upstream of the Arch Bridge where we're taking the picture from. And here again is the Presbyterian Church. This is the backside of the horse nail company. And these buildings here are the horse nail factories. Now here's a view taken from the Arch Bridge, looking upstream. And we see a dam over here. And this created water power for Prescott and Weston Company and the Adirondack Twine Company buildings that were located on this side of the river. Also, you can barely make out faintly the swing bridge that went across the Osceola River back here. And that was strictly a walk-through bridge. Went from Clinton Street over to the other side here on Clinton County. Here's a neat overview of a good part of Kiesel that's located in Clinton County. Over in this section is a swing bridge, went from a point here over to here. And back in, I think it was 1840s, early 1840s, there was another swing bridge at that same location. And at one point that year, they had some militia cross the bridge, and they were followed by some children and other Kiesville citizens. And the cadence from their march started to cause vibrations, which ultimately caused the bridge to sway and eventually collapse. And 13 people were drowned in that particular accident.
That's amazing. I never heard
And
that
yet
story.
Yet they came back and built another one at the same spot. Also on this view, I'd like to point out this building, which belonged to the Kingsland. It belonged to Alfred Kingsland, I think was the son of either Edmund or Nelson Kingsland. And eventually it was donated to the Catholic Church, and it became a private Catholic church for young ladies. Also on this view, right above the academy, Macaulay Academy it was called, is the French Catholic Church, the top of it. And as we move over here, this is the schoolhouse we looked at earlier. And then this is Sable Street, and runs through here. Of course, Main Street runs up in this area. And along here were several stables that serviced the various hotels and were used to make runs to Sable Forks and to Sable Chasm. The next view is going to be taken from a vantage point right about here. We're going to be looking that way. Here's our last view of Kiesville, and it shows the covered bridge that runs from one side of the river to the other. This was built in 1856 after the Great Flood of 1856, which destroyed just about every bridge in the area and caused havoc to all the industry along both sides of the river. The rocks jutting up here were placed there intentionally to break up the ice flows. Eventually this bridge's roof collapsed. I believe it was in 1874. And temporarily rebuilt the roof, and but they decided to eventually replace that bridge with an iron bridge, and that iron bridge is still there today. Down in this area we have another area of nail works, all these buildings here. There was also a machine shop in this area, and a carpenter shop. And of course this all belonged to the Kingsland. Next. Now from Kiesville, we go to Sable Forks, about 12 miles down the road. And this particular view was taken from Burt Hill, and gives us a little overview of Sable Forks. Those of you that are familiar with Sable Forks would know that Graves Mansion is now located right here. And the back of, and this would be the hill in back of Graves Mansion. Now at this time, actually starting in the 1830s, Sable Chasm became a town dominated by the J.J. Rogers Iron Company, and it became a classical company town. I can point out, here's the forge. You can notice the smoke here. Here's the J&J Rogers headquarters building. And this is the building that had to be removed when the mansion, Gray's Mansion, was built here. And this is where Mr. Burt lived. And Mr. Burt supposedly built the J Bridge and the covered bridge that I showed you earlier in Keysville. Now here's a view looking directly at the J.J. Rogers headquarters building. There are a lot of other interesting things in this view. Here's the covered bridge. This would be the Main Street covered bridge. And then directly back here is another covered bridge. And this was located on Mill Road, which went over to where the rolling mill was in this location back here. It was a wheelwright shop down here. Here's a view looking up Main Street, and here's the Main Street covered bridge way in the entrance to it, way in the back. We're on the Essex County side of West Haven Forks. And that bridge here would lead over to the American House. And on this side of the bridge, here we see the Methodist Church that was there, and on this side was the Episcopal Church. And over in this area, although we can't see it, would have been the headquarters. Now, in 1925, just about everything you see here was burnt down. West Haven Forks had a major fire, which consumed the two churches. It even consumed that three-story headquarters building, J.J. and Rogers headquarters building. There were just one or two little stores over in this area that were saved. Now, right across from the Methodist Church was the Episcopalian Church. James Rogers went to the Episcopalian Church, and his brother was a Methodist and went to the Methodist Church.
Aha!
Of course, when both these churches burnt down, the Rogers company was still in existence. Now as a paper-making company. And they refinanced they got enough money together to put both churches up again. Funny thing about this church, this is one of the first views that I came across before I realized that George Baldwin took views in West Haven Forks. And when I got the view, I went to Keysville looking for this particular church, because on the side of the card it said Keysville, New York. So several times I went there and I couldn't find it. And one time I had the view next to me on the seat, and I was stopped in front of the church because the school bus,
There, see?
school buses were coming out. So all of a sudden I looked at it and said, my God,
There it is.
there it is.
I love it.
And I belong to that church.
Isn't that beautiful?
The only difference in the new church really was it was rebuilt, the same way it is here practically. It didn't have the steeple anymore. So this church actually opened in I think the first service here was held 1876 Christmas Eve. Here's a closer look at the Rogers building again. Here's one entrance. This is to the offices, as stated above. And here's another entrance here. And this entrance went into the J.J. Rogers company store. Here's a great interior shot of J.J. Rogers company store. And they sold dry goods, they sold drugs, they sold food.
They sold magic oil.
Magic oil, I just going to say that. So I think these are all the clerks involved in the operation of the store. And at that time, the employees of J.J. and Rogers were paid by scrip, which was really a money substitute, which only could be spent at the company store.
Sure, that's the way they did it.
And that was a way of controlling controlling wages, either increasing or decreasing it by changing the prices of the items sold at the store. Of course, that practice was discontinued sometime in the 1880s. Now here's a side view. This is on the side of the building. And here we see some of the same clerks we just saw in the store, but also there's a couple of additional people here in the seated area. And the only one we've been able to identify is Henry Graves, sits in the middle here. And we know that in 1877, a year or two after this picture was taken, he became vice president when James Rogers retired. Then in 1879, he became president when John Rogers died. And then it was 2 or 3 years after that that he built the Graves Mansion.
Look at all the nice watch chains, see?
Gold watches on it.
Yeah, you bet. Okay.
The J&J Rogers Company got their iron from 2 main sources. One was the Arnold Hill mines over in North Sable Township, and the other one was the Palmer Hill mines over in Blackbrook area. This is a picture of the hoist building over in the Arnold Hill mine, and this is actually a mine opening inside that building. And in that building, the ore could be hoisted up to ground level before being brought to another place for servicing or processing. Excuse me. Next, please. Here's the back side of that same building, and we can see some of the hoist machinery right here. And of course, this is a posed view showing the miners and probably some of the supervisors and a curious group of kids here who may or may not have worked in the mines. From here, the iron would be shipped to separator area. We'll look at that next. This is the separator works in Osable Forks. Actually, it's right outside of Osable Forks. There's a road that is called Separator Road, and this would have been along that road. Here's a road going to the separator works, and here's a water and a sluice to control the water as it went to the separator works. In the area of the separator works, usually outdoors, the ore would be placed on top of wood where it would be burned to remove the slag from the iron and to attempt to make it more pure. After that was done, it would be brought into the separator building, which I believe is probably this group of buildings here, where it would be shaken, hammered, vibrated, and flushed to remove the rest of the slag. From the separator works, the iron would go to the forges. Here we have a 4-stack forge that was located in Osable Forks. In the first view we saw of Osable Forks, I showed you where this was, and you could see the smoke. The iron ore would be brought to this building and heated at very high temperatures, and charcoal would be used for the heating process. And the men that controlled the hearth or the burning area were called bloomers, and they were skilled workmen. They knew exactly when to remove the iron, and they knew when at what point it was desirable to remove the iron, to rework it, and also that it was in a pure form at that point. From the forge, the iron billets, or they called them the iron blooms also, they were like short little logs, a couple of feet long. They would either go right down to Port Kent and be dropped off at the docks down there for further shipment to any one of a number of different iron manufacturing people or firms. But also, some of the billets would end up in this particular spot, which was what we see here is the interior of the rolling mill in Osceola Forks. And here the iron would be heated and shaped into plates from which nails could be made, or would be shaped into standard bars for shipment from that point in time. Here's an exterior view of that rolling mill. Next to this rolling mill was to the right, which we can't see, was a nail factory. And back of it was a carpenter's shop. And the mill street covered bridge came across right here, right at the entrance to the building. Next one. Can we go back one view? I just want to point something out. I'd like to point out back here we have the American House. Now, we referred to it before because Baldwin's father-in-law owned the American House and was proprietor of the American House. But it was a very important stop because it was a transfer point for stagecoaches. From the American House, you could pick up fresh horses and you can go to any one of 3 paths which led into the Adirondacks. One would be along Blackbrook Road, another one would be through Wilmington Notch, and then finally another one would lead you to Keene Valley area. Next, please. Now this is John Brown's home. Now this particular view was not taken by Baldwin, it's taken by Stoddard. Some of you may recognize
Oh, yes,
the format up here.
Seneca Ray.
Yeah. When John Brown had often said, when I die, bring my body back to North Elba and bury me by the old rock where I used to sit and pray. And that's exactly what happened. And of course, this eventually became a tourist site. When this picture was taken, John Brown's home was owned by a private company that sort of made a park out of it. And when Seneca Ray Stoddard visited the farm in 1873, he noted that that year, he visited in October, and he noted that that past summer, some 400 people had signed the register. So it was already quite an attraction, even though it was in the middle of nowhere. Now this view, and we're back to Baldwin now. In the background here is Whiteface Mountain. This is Lake Placid. At this point in time, Lake Placid wasn't really too well known. There were only a couple of buildings in Lake Placid. And we'll see those. Here's the first settler lived in this complex here. This is Jane Nash's farm, which was converted to an inn. Couldn't accommodate about 25, 30 people. And this picture was taken from the Excelsior House, which had just been built and became part of the MASH complex. The Excelsior House later on would be called Stevens. More people might be familiar with that name. Now, this is the first real hotel built in Lake Placid, called the Brewster House. I also believe it was called Lake Placid House or Inn. It was built in the mid-1870s, probably just before this picture was taken. And it turns out that in 1892, George Baldwin bought this establishment.
Amazing.
Yeah, he had just moved from Plattsburgh to Saranac Lake, where he set up a new studio, and he bought this place. Probably he used it as an outlet for his photographs, besides being a real estate investment. He owned it for several years, and then he sold it. Now, if you go along that Blackbrook Road from Sable Forks towards Saranac Lake, readily available would be this site, which was Paul Smith's on St. Regis Lake. Here we have a view of the hotel, and this is where the guides stayed, and also where the boats were kept. Paul Smith had this built in 1859. In his guidebook, says Paul Smith's first-class hotel, built in the middle of a howling wilderness. And such it was, but people flocked to Paul Smith's to rest, to hunt, to fish, and to partake of Mrs. Smith's superb kitchen. Also, they came to be entertained by Paul Smith. He was a great storyteller and was often compared to Mark Twain. Here's another view of Paul Smith, the hotel complex being here. And this is the guide house with the openings for the boats. Paul Smith bought many other properties beside this as time went on, and he became a millionaire. This particular site is now Paul Smith's college. Next. This is a view of Martin's on Saranac Lake. This was the first hotel built in that area strictly for sportsmen. It could accommodate about 200 people. It was called the House with the Hole in the Wall, which is this area here. The road was on the opposite side, and the carriages could come through this hole and park here. And, next, please. Now, this is a started view, and I included it to show this particular guide boat here. Bill Martin's son, Willie's, probably built this boat. He started building canoes at the age of 16. And became known for his eggshell boat. What it really was a lightweight type guide boat, 30% lighter than the average guide boats at that time.
Hello. Can you please tell me if 314 is nearby?
Yeah, we had a brief interruption. Okay, go right ahead. That's a great boat.
And here we see some of the guides waiting for various visitors to take them out either hunting, fishing, or just for a boat ride.
Sure.
Excuse me. This is another area, another fine establishment called Bartlett's. It was built in the 1850s also, and could only be reached by water. It was on a carry between Round Lake and I believe Lower Saranac Lake. It was considered the greatest fishing spot in the Adirondacks
It was,
at that
huh?
time. Yeah. It could only accommodate about 50 people, but now here's a view taken, we think, at moonlight at Bartlett's Landing, which was the landing to carry between Round Lake and Saranac Lake. And you can see the wheel tracks here. They would put the boats on the wagon and take them from one lake into the other one. Also note the changes in the moon here. Some people tell me that this photo was really taken during the daytime, that it really wasn't feasible to take this picture at night because of the exposure times involved, that they would take it during the daytime and underexpose it somehow. I'm not sure whether it was taken days or nights, but
I would not know. It's a beautiful shot.
it looks like a beautiful shot.
Very moody sky, isn't it, huh?
On the road from Sable Forks to Paul Smith in the Saranac Lake region was this house called French's Hotel. It was the halfway house between those 2 points. French added an addition on in the early 70s, which is over here, and it went from a farmhouse to a hotel. Stagecoaches would stop here. It was sort of a fast food shop and a place where you could rest for a while. Also, another attraction of French's was that it was a spot from which you could climb Whiteface Mountain. It was on the back side, the north side of Whiteface Mountain, where the slope is much gentler in that area. And French himself had a 4-mile road built toward the summit, which could accommodate wagons, and then the last several miles had to be accomplished by foot. He also provided a camp on the top of the mountain, and those hardy souls that wanted to stay up there could watch the sunset and sunrise before going back to French's. Baldwin titled this view Camp Comfort, and it's quite obvious that none of these people are really dressed to go into the wilderness. But here they are holding guns and fishing nets and fishing poles. The gentleman with the gun looks like he might be a guide, but really for the others this was a photo opportunity
Of course.
for them to have their picture taken. And as I said, postcards were not available those days. They would take this picture and it would be a souvenir of their trip into the Adirondack wilderness.
Beautiful.
Next. Now here's an actual camp. This was at a place called Edmonds Pond. It was called Enterprise Camp. Edmonds Pond now is known as Cascade Lake, which I guess is part of the High Peaks area. Back here we notice the lean-to. This looks like an area where one could sit down and eat. And this was a real wilderness. And these camps were seasonal. They would set them up each year. And the group that ran the camp would make arrangements with local inns for them to bring their visitors to this particular camp, especially if they wanted to go hunting or fishing in the area. Next we go to Keene. And this particular view is of Hull's Falls in Keene. And up here we know this old rustic type bridge. Keene Valley, Keene and Keene Valley, primarily Keene Valley, was a place that attracted writers and artists. It was very popular. even back then, still attracts crowds and all.
What a shot. What a shot. Is that a classic? Oh, my.
You know who that is?
No.
Orson Phelps.
Oh, my goodness. I should have known. Isn't that great?
This is taken in Keene Valley in front of Orson Phelps' home.
Look at this. Everything about that photograph has immense character.
Isn't it? And Orson Phelps was quite a character.
He sure was.
As I said, Keene Valley was...
I almost see the puff of smoke coming out of his mouth.
Yep.
I'm sorry.
No, that's right. Keene Valley was a place with its quiet valley and wild mountain scenery that attracted artists and writers. And Orson Phelps was their favorite guy. He was witty and he had a sort of an earthly intellect, and he could talk with anyone. And they loved him, even though he wasn't the greatest guy in the world. He claims to have climbed Mount Marcy over 100 times.
I've seen that picture before. The hell, we started our show with that, didn't we?
That's
huh?
right. Now, we don't know if this particular view is staged or what.
It's a great shot, though, isn't it?
Well, whatever,
It's got
it's a great
everything in
shot.
it.
Yep. Here we see Snowy Owl and 2 chicks. And if you look at this in 3D, you'll notice you're way up in the air
Oh,
somewhere.
sure.
So it's hard to tell where this picture was taken from. Maybe another tree or some elevated area
Great shot.
next to this particular spot. This is our last and final view. And this is one of the few stereo views that Baldwin took outside the Adirondack area. And it's officers' barracks in Plattsburgh. And at this point in time, I think it was the 5th Artillery Division that was housed in this particular area at the time. These buildings still stand today.
I think that's the stone barracks to the right that they're going to be
You're
using.
probably more familiar with it than
As
I am.
part of the interpretive center, this is an entire campus that'll be used to commemorate all the military history of Plattsburgh, which dates back to Revolutionary days. It's a huge amount of history right there, huh? The ghosts of the old soldiers have got to be trekking through there from time to time, don't they? What a beautiful shot. I've never seen this particular shot before.
He took a group of views. This is the only one I've come across. Seneca Ray Stoddard also took a group of views of these barracks. And those I've seen on and off, like in the papers or history books.
Sure.
Well, this is our final view for this particular show.
I love it. We'll turn the lights on and wrap up this great show. What a kick this has been for me, a very special kick. Man, I have a few words over here who did very well on the trigger finger there.
Thank you.
That's fun, isn't it?
It is.
Do you enjoy seeing them every time?
I can look at them 100 times and still enjoy it.
You know, it's all fresh and new to me, and most of those views I had never seen before. But that's a time period, before, during, and after the Civil War, that I think has a certain charm for all of us, because it's a huge part of our nation's history, and what a great part in the North Country history. That's got to be fun for you, too.
Oh, it is. I still look at all those stereo views with the viewer.
Do you?
When I have nothing better to do, I get out the views and take a look at them.
Well, and not to mention the history of photography, which, you know, we looked at it today, didn't we? From some of the very beginnings right up to the end of his life and career.
Yeah. Baldwin recorded, a vanishing way of life, and also his pictures helped get birth to tourism. So, his photos are important.
Gunther and Ron, thank you so much for being with us here today. I have a feeling that there's another chapter bubbling right under the surface here. You can make it. I thank you both for inviting us here into the into this wonderful old civic center, the old school in Keysville. We've enjoyed it. I know Calvin has. And his shoulder got a rest because we did a lot of that show on the tripod, so that's a good thing.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to do this.
We'll be back, and thank you for helping to preserve these wonderful golden memories. And who knows where we're going to be next time for our little corner.